All right, let's talk about the new Supra. And the new Supra, let's be honest, sort of sucks. They were waiting to reveal it at the Detroit Auto Show, but then they did a full front reveal, one that was sitting on the truck in silver, and then a full rear reveal of a yellow one that just happened to be parked somewhere. So next thing you know, it's like, all right, now we know what the car looks like. And then there was some awkward, leak.
Onward.
The manufacturers suck with this. Some random guy has the awkward leak when he clicked on the wrong link on the website, and it just shows the reveal of what the thing looks like before we reveal it. In the worst kept secret since the C8 Corvette, the Supra is now here in all its glory to disappoint. I've got no reason to believe that this is not what the Supra is going to look like. But if you look at all the renderings over time, half of them look much cooler than what the finished product is. And why is that relevant? Well, you look at the Supra and yeah, that's pretty cool. It's like the Supra, but it's not. And I have a feeling it's going to go the same way of the NSX. Unless the aftermarket can really take a hold of this car and grab the car by the horns. And one of the things that made the other Supra awesome wasn't that it was fast, because it wasn't fast. It was that it was moddable. And the 2JZ motor was able to hold a shit ton of boost.
The path is clear.
A lot of power at it. And you were way ahead of the curve. Way ahead of the game. The Supras used to be unstoppable.
Truth compels
until they started turboing Vipers. And a Viper is a formidable car to begin with. The turbos on a 10-cylinder engine
shall not
to keep
prevail.
up with an inline six was something
None shall hinder
that made
me.
that car iconic. It's not that the Fast and the Furious picked it up, but that's what made the Fast and the Furious pick it up as the hero car, because the Supra was sort of the hands-down champ of street racing. It was just that thing would take off into the distance. And it's got such a great highway race persona, because virtually every video of a Supra is like, somebody thinks they're winning, and then the Supra just comes freight training by, because when you do put the big turbo on it, you get a lot of lag, and it makes a shit ton of horsepower, but it's not instantaneous. You don't have that torque that you're used to in a lot of the bigger engine cars that are super torquey, and they're lined up. Big horsepower Corvette may get out on it, but the Supra is just going to come trucking right by. And the gearing is really good for top end too. So it all really works.
Yes.
It's what led into, and it's a cool looking car, it's what led into making the fourth gen Supra iconic car. Now the market on those seems to be on fire, and people are like, these cars are selling for a lot of money. Bring a Trailer just had a car that closed yesterday. A red 6-speed turbo, $121,000 plus a $6,000 premium for Bring a Trailer. You're talking $127,000 for a 94 Supra with 70, it's sub 8,000 miles on the actual. I think it was 7,100. So, bone stock car. And what's funny about that is that those cars aren't really great stock. They're really pretty boring. I mean, you're talking it's like a couple hundred horsepower and not really wowing anyone.
Out of my way.
But when you start throwing a lot of power on that, at least at the very minimum, a BPU car is fun. If the BPU is a performance upgrade, downpipe, turbo upgrade, and not even necessarily a turbo upgrade, but more boost, the downpipe. You go look on the Super forums, you'll see what all the
keep away.
Upgrades are that everybody did. But I mean, my Supra running a stock intake manifold, making almost 1,000.
None shall hinder me.
So it's just amazing, and that Supra hasn't been touched in like 7 or 8 years. So you're talking 8 years ago, we're making with a stock intake. It was quite the car. Now, why is the market on fire? Well, because frankly, as is easily to predict, people my age are finally coming into money and saying, I want one of those. I've always wanted one of those as a kid. And you get this wave of depreciation because nobody wants it because it's the older model. Oh, wait, I sort of want that little collector market coming. And then next thing you know, everybody that grew up loving those cars can now afford them. And the 90s cars went up in value. It was the 80s cars that went up in value. And not before Corvettes for their stuff.
Then
the 90s cars all go up in value. The RX-7s start creeping up.
Out of my way.
I mean, obviously the McLaren F1, but the F50s, the F40s, all these cars, the 355s, they all start coming up in value. I hate it.
Be gone.
The E36 lightweight M3. Nothing really terrific about that car. The air-cooled Porsches, it's the cars we grew up with. They're cool looking. They perform well. They're moddable, they're reliable,
light in the
fairly
darkness.
reliable, and the market is come on. And then as time goes on and they become more scarce and people buy and hold them, and there's fewer out there, more people have to pay more money, and that drives the market up. So my car, I'm actually in the process of going tomorrow, Monday. Take a look at Monday.
Beset on all sides. Still
Maybe
hold
next
the
week,
door.
I'm gonna go
Choose
check
your
out the car.
words.
I've got mine running. I'm shipping it down to Florida to do the half mile. Who knows who's going to end up coming to that
As
right
thou
now.
wilt.
Maybe Adam LZ. I may just bring somebody with a fast ass car like a 48 Pizza
Yes.
or a Senna or something down there to race me. So I've got a good opponent. I don't know
I
if Street
lighten
Speed's
thy
going to
load.
come. I know Garrett's cars are all laid up, so he's not going to have anything to run. Tommy is going over to Japan right now, so he's not going to be available to run. He was going to have his F-15 available, but that's not going to be ready. So it looks like it's going to be me at the half mile that want to go fast down in South Florida on the 20th. And I'm going to bring somebody with me. I'm not going to go race by myself, but once I commit, once I book my flights, and once I start prepping the car, I'll show up.
Magically
Let's see if
dashed.
Street Speed does the same thing. You get a 720. There's never going to be anything wrong with that thing. It's just going to be fast out of the box, and it'll be fun to go beat up with him, beat up on him with the Supra if he shows up. So we'll see what happens there. But right now, the Supra, we clean the injectors,
Onward.
drain the gas. We've got it on pump gas, but I'm going to run it on C16 anyway. And
I
if
go.
I have time, I'm going to try. I've reached out to Garrett to try to get a better turbo for it. My precision turbo is not good now, and it made 933 to the wheels on 32 pounds of boost. Worst case scenario, I'll crank it up to 35 pounds.
Thou and I
1,000.
must have a frank
The
discussion.
injectors aren't maxed out yet or anything like that. So
Time to get your head above water.
Grow some
I don't really want to go
gills.
much beyond 35, but I sort of want to hit 1,001 or whatever it is. I'm going to put new tires on the car. Brakes are fine. Everything else is fine.
Get thee
And we're going to
hence.
ship down, and we're going to go see what we can do. I did 213 a mile in the car, so I expect something
Out of
good.
my
The
way.
190 probably, hopefully, especially if they add another 80 wheel horsepower. The gearing is good. The tires will be good. And I'm expecting good things. Then, that's
Thou
pretty much
art
the
mine.
last I plan on doing with the car.
Truth
If
compels
I don't
me.
swap the turbo, that is. Then I'm going to ship the car out to Chicago. I'm just going to do a couple
Yes.
little tweaks on it. There's little things on the car that are from going back together.
As thou
Never
wilt.
went back together. Like the door has like little clips that go in the door handle, and that's stuff that you've never noticed unless you're looking. But we didn't put those little caps in, so I got to get rid of those caps for $6. I've got the little blanks that go into the console that I'm missing. Those are a couple of bucks. It's like standard straight Toyota Celica blanks. But it's just the stuff to
Vile
finish off the
creatures.
car, so it's perfect. We're going to ship it out to Chicago Motor Cars. They're going to sell it in the spring unless somebody wants it before it goes to them.
Tis on thy head.
And Perenni's talking about listing it in the spring for about 150 grand. I know it's saying, oh my God, 150 grand, why would you ever? That's what it's going to sell for, what I expect it to sell for. Even though people thought this $121,000, 7,000 miles
Tis
car
on
was
thy
big numbers.
head.
I know two that sold. The 98s get the bigger money. The 94 is just not as desirable. The 98s are the shortest run in the U.S. And a 98 black 6
Something bad is happening to your top tower.
A modified
go.
one sold for $139. I think it was Certified Motors down in Florida. Sold a RSP, which is blue.
The
Automatic
true path.
swap to 60, which should decrease the value, with 1,000 plus horsepower. And that one, well-built car, mine also well-built, but mine's also reversible. Sold for $139. He also sold one with, I think, 14,000 miles, black 98 6-speed. With 14,000 miles, he sold for 150 in like days. So my car, fully reversible back to stock. You could do whatever you want with it if you buy it. I don't care if you
Aye.
want to return it back to stock and spend a couple $1,000s to do that. You want to jump the Grand Canyon in the damn thing. I don't really
None
care.
shall hinder
but
me.
to assume that, oh, I wouldn't pay that money for that car, this guy wouldn't pay that money for that car. If you look at what, like you'll look when Supras are listed online, they ask big money and then they don't show back up for sale, which means they probably sold for big money. Whether it's
vow thy
a public knowledge sale or it's broadcasted that it sold for a lot of money, doesn't mean it didn't. You could tell when a car
The true
doesn't sell
path.
for a lot of money because it's listed, and then it gets relisted and relisted and relisted, and then the price keeps coming down. That means the market's not so hot. When you see a car listed for sale and all of a sudden it's not for sale anymore, it's because somebody else owned it and somebody else paid a good
Out of
amount
my
of money
way.
for it. That's why it doesn't come back up for sale. that's what I plan on doing with mine. So if you're interested in my car and you want to make a real offer, it's got to be
The
very
path
close
is
to
clear.
150. What am I going to do with that money? Well, I'm going to go buy another Supra, but I'm going to buy one with like 60,000 miles,
creatures.
70,000 miles, significantly lower, and I'll modify it to the same degree or similar degree, maybe not 1,000 wheel, but something like the 650 rear wheel horsepower. I'll gas, I'll go out and enjoy it. But it doesn't have to be a 98, 80, whatever, 95, 96, 97. And I'm looking forward to it. And I'm looking forward to enjoying it. As I said, my car, I could return it back to stock.
Missing
I could spend virtually
Onward.
$5,000 to do so. But the appeal of the car is that it's moddable. Some people like the mod. Some people would buy it and then modify it. I'll just leave it as is. And whatever happens, happens. It's about time I actually sell it. I've been talking about doing it forever. And now the new one is apparently great interest in the namesake. If you look at the new NSX, the prices go like this. The old NSX, the prices go like that. It's just because that's an NSX, and this one really isn't. And that's where we really stand with the, let's just say, disappointing Supra. I'm really hoping when it does get revealed that I'm wrong. I don't think I am, and maybe it'll grow on me. But right now, I don't think I'm going to be spending my money on one of those. I think I'm going to spend my money on the old one and get one that I can drive and enjoy, because I haven't really been doing that with this. I've been enjoying the shit out of it when I do drive it, but I only drive it 7 miles at a time. I drive it onto the trailer, I go to the event, I do 10 miles on it and pull it back onto the trailer, and it's 6
mine.
So it'll be nice to actually get out there,
As
race
thou
some people,
wilt.
race some cool cars, beat up on some things.
I'll take that as tribute.
Sell it in the spring and move
Your
on to the
middle
next chapter.
tower is
None
under
shall
attack.
hinder me. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.
Truth compels me. Your middle tower is under attack.
Hey guys, Chris Fix here, and today I'm going to show you how to remove and install a transmission in your car or your truck. Now the reason why you might need to remove a transmission, maybe you're going to send it out to get rebuilt, or maybe you have a clutch that's wearing out so you need to replace the clutch. You could also have an oil leak at the rear of your engine where the engine and transmission meet, and that could be an indication that you have a bad rear main seal. You could have a bad pilot bearing or a bad throw-up bearing, which is exactly what happened to my Mustang. Listen to this. So if we're in neutral and we go to start the car,
They're trying to
take our foot off the clutch, and that's a bad throw-out bearing. Watch this, if I press on the clutch, it goes away, but when I take my foot off the clutch, it comes right back. So before I cause any damage, I'm going to shut this off, and let's get that fixed. Now, in order to replace the throw-out bearing, as well as the other parts that I mentioned, you need to drop the transmission out of the car or truck. But don't worry, it's not that difficult. I'm going to show you all my tips and tricks on how to remove the transmission and then how to install it so that you'll be able to do this at home yourself. And here are all the tools that you're going to need. You're going to need a ratchet, a good socket set, some extensions, and you're definitely going to want one of these universal joint extensions to get to the hard-to-reach bolts. You're going to want a couple of wrenches, torque wrench, and possibly a breaker bar. You're also going to need a jack and jack stands. You're going to need a drain pan and some transmission fluid, and I highly suggest getting a transmission jack. I see a lot of guys try to take the transmission out using a regular jack. A lot of times the transmission will fall over. You could crack the case. That would be a very expensive mistake. This is inexpensive. I'll link it in the description. Totally worth the get. You could strap down the transmission. It'll just make your job that much easier. With the amount of money that you're saving, it's totally worth the investment. And that's just about everything you're going to need to remove and install a transmission. So with that being said, let me show you the 10 steps to remove the transmission. First, we need to safely lift the vehicle, then remove the negative battery cable, remove the shifter, exhaust, drain the transmission fluid, disconnect the drive shaft, remove the starter, remove and set aside the wiring harness, unbolt the transmission mount, and unbolt and remove the transmission. And while that might seem like a lot, it's really not that bad. What I did is I broke it down to a bunch of smaller, easy to accomplish steps so that as we do this job, we could stay organized. And I will include a link in the description to this checklist so you could download it and print it if you want to use it. With that said, let's get started, and the first step is to lift and support the vehicle. And as you can see, I already safely lifted the car up and put it on jack stands just like you would anytime you're working on your car. But I do have a few tips and tricks specifically for if you're removing the transmission, so let's cover them. And the first one is you need to make sure that your car is lifted high enough to remove a transmission. Transmissions are pretty big, so you need enough room to drop it down and slide it out. In this case, I couldn't use ramps because my lowered car just wouldn't get lifted high enough. Well, now if you have a lift at home, great, use it. But most people, including myself, don't have a lift, so I'll be using good old jack stands. And instead of using your normal 3-ton jack stands, I went out and I bought myself some 12-ton jack stands. The 12-ton jack stands will give you a lot more lift than your classic 3-ton, and I don't even have to extend the jack stand, so they're gonna be a lot more stable. Another trick when you're placing your jacks, you want to make sure you separate them as far apart as possible so they're not right underneath the transmission. That way you could get your transmission jack under there and have plenty of room to work and drop that transmission out without interfering with your jack stands. So for me, the perfect place to put these jacks was right on the frame rail and move them out far enough, and it's also on a nice solid support. And my last quick tip for lifting your vehicle up has to do with safety. Even though we have 2 jack stands in the front and 2 in the rear, I still like to go in the front and slide something underneath the front tires. We're using a ramp, you could use a wheel, whatever it is to keep you safe. I also like to put a jack on the front cross member, lightly supporting it, just in case. You never know, if you're removing the transmission and then the transmission bumps the jack, now the car's falling on a ramp and not falling on you. I always like to play it safe, and when your car is safely lifted up, now we can move on to the next step, which is to remove the negative battery cable. So pop open the cover and unscrew the clamp and slide the cable off the battery post. Set aside the cable and make sure it doesn't touch the battery post. So with the negative cable removed, now we could go on to our next step, and let's remove the shifter. And the reason why you want to remove your shifter so early in the process, this is our 3rd step. We haven't gotten under the car, we haven't drained transmission fluid, done the exhaust, any of that stuff, which could get you greasy and dirty. Right now, I could touch the interior and not have to worry about anything because my hands are clean. So make sure you do this first before you get your hands greasy. Now let's make sure the car's in neutral and just unscrew the shift knob to remove it. Next, remove the shifter trim by prying it upwards and slide it off the shifter lever. Now we can unscrew these 2 nuts holding the shifter lever on, and then slide the lever off the shifter like so. Then there's 4 bolts holding in this shifter boot, so unscrew all 4 of them. And because I have my hydro e-brake tied into one of these bolts, I need to slide the boot cover up and over to remove it. Just like that. And finally, there's 4 bolts holding in the short shifter. So let's remove all of these. And now we can remove the shifter. And with our shifter removed, that's gonna give us a lot more room to drop the transmission down, and nothing's gonna get hung up here. It'll also help when we fill the transmission with transmission fluid later on, because we could fill it from right here instead of the side of the transmission, which becomes a mess. So now we can move on to the next step, which is to remove the exhaust. Now you wanna double check, because in some cars you might not need to remove your exhaust system to get your transmission out. In this case, our transmission runs from the front here all the way back to the X pipe, so we definitely have to remove the exhaust. Luckily, we don't have to remove the entire exhaust. We're going to just remove from the downpipe up here to the X pipe right here. But before we do that, we want to disconnect our oxygen sensors. And instead of unscrewing each oxygen sensor from the exhaust, it's a lot easier to just disconnect them from the wiring harness. So just press down on this clip and then pull them apart like so. So with the 2 downstream oxygen sensors disconnected, now we need to remove the 2 upstream oxygen sensors. There's one on this side of the exhaust right there, and there's one on the other side of the exhaust right there. So press down on the clip and pull to disconnect it. Now we can move to the other side and disconnect this oxygen sensor the same way. Good, so with all the oxygen sensors disconnected, now we can remove the nuts holding in this downpipe and holding in that downpipe. So let's get started on the driver's side. I like to spray down the exhaust fasteners with penetrating fluid anytime I go to remove them, so they come off easier, especially if they're rusted. Now we can get our 18mm socket and remove the top nut, and then remove the bottom one. Good. Now let's do the same thing on the other side. Remove the top nut, and for the bottom one, we need to use a universal joint extension because we don't have a straight shot at getting to that fastener since the frame is in the way. So remove this nut. Good. And with the 2 front exhaust pipes disconnected, now we can move to the back bolts behind the X pipe. There's 4 bolts that need to come out, and using a ratcheting wrench makes this real quick and easy. Now with all 4 rear fasteners removed, we could separate the exhaust pipes and remove the exhaust from the car. All right, so with the front of our exhaust removed, now we can go back under the car. And our next step is to drain the transmission fluid. Now we want to do this because we're going to be removing the drive shaft, which means that fluid could come pouring out of the tail shaft, especially when we drop the transmission down. We don't want to make a mess, so draining it now will prevent that mess. We also are going to be replacing the clutch. You might as well get some new fluid in there, so draining it out and filling up with some new fluid later will definitely help out. And finally, draining the fluid out now is going to lighten up this transmission. The lighter the transmission, the easier it is to remove. So let's get that transmission fluid out of here. And all you have to do, right over here, we have the transmission drain plug. You're just going to get a box end of a 3/8 ratchet and just crack it open like so. Don't forget the drain pan. And let's loosen this the rest of the way. Beautiful. Now we're going to let all this fluid drain out. And once it drains completely, we could screw the drain bolt back in and tighten it up. Don't over tighten it, just make it snug because you could easily strip the threads in the aluminum transmission case. All right, and with our transmission fluid removed, now we can move on to our next step, which is to remove the drive shaft. We don't have to worry about the drive shaft on this end because this just slides out once we remove the bolts where the drive shaft meets the differential. Now there's 4 bolts holding this in. Since we're in neutral, let's spin the drive shaft. You can see there's 2 bolts right here and there's 2 bolts on the other side. Now you want to set the parking brake. That way when we get our wrench on here and we turn it, the drive shaft doesn't move. And one thing to keep an eye on with drive shaft bolts, a lot of times they're not the normal 6-point bolt that you're used to. In this case, we're removing 12-point bolts. So just make sure that you're using a 12-point wrench or a 12-point socket when you're removing these bolts, because the 6-point will strip this out. So again, with the 12-point wrench on here, now we can remove these bolts. Oh man, and that is not budging. Sometimes these get stuck on there pretty good. So to loosen the bolt, heat up the metal surrounding the bolt. And I'm also going to be using a longer wrench to give me more leverage. And there we go. That's how you remove a stuck drive shaft bolt. Now follow the same process for the other bolts. Heat it up, then loosen it, and remove it. Now release the e-brake and spin the drive shaft so we have access to the 2 other bolts. Then engage that e-brake again, and the same as before, heat around the bolt, loosen it up, and remove it. Heat around the bolt, loosen it up, and remove it. Now the drive shaft should come right out back here. And in the front, we want to slide it out with a catch can under the end of the transmission, just to catch any extra fluid that might leak out. And one trick I have is to get a sandwich bag and open it up around the end of the transmission, so when we lower it down, it won't leak everywhere if it tilts backwards. All right, and with this drive shaft removed, we are one step closer to removing the transmission, so let's get back underneath the car and work on the next step, which is to remove the starter. The starter is located right where the engine and transmission meet, and in this case, it's on the passenger side right over here. So there are 3 bolts that are holding in our starter. All of them you have to get to from this back side. The first one is right here, the second one is right here, and the third one you can't even see, it's tucked up back here. So let's start with these 2, which are a lot easier to remove. First, get the oxygen sensor wire out of the way. Then we need to break this nut free, and then unscrew it and remove this metal mount which is in the way. Now let's remove the first bolt holding in the starter. Good. And with that bolt out, we don't have to disconnect any wires back here because we're going to just have this starter hang right over here. We don't have to remove it completely. We just need to get it out of the transmission bell housing. So the next bolt we need to remove is this one right here, and you can kind of feel it on the back here, but there's no room in here to get a ratchet. So what we're going to do is we're going to come around to the front of the engine, and that's going to give us better access. So if you take a look into this gap right here, you can see the second bolt that we need to get to. And now to get all the way to that bolt, we're going to be using a long extension. So slide that extension all the way in.
What's dying is mine.
And get it on that bolt head. Then we can break it loose and loosen it the rest of the way. And I'll get my hand back here. Good. Now to get to the third hard to reach bolt, which is all the way back here, well, the trick to removing that bolt is to use a little 1/4-inch ratchet with an extension. And we'll get this ratchet back behind the starter, get the socket on the bolt, and break it loose. And there's just enough room to move the ratchet back and forth to unscrew the bolt. So with that bolt removed, now we can remove the starter and set it aside so it's out of the way. And now we can move on to the next step, which is to disconnect the wiring harness. We have a wiring harness that runs along the top of the transmission, and it's clipped into the transmission. So we want to disconnect it. We don't actually have to remove it from the car, just disconnect it and set it off to the side so that we can lower the transmission down without this getting hung up. So we're going to start back here at the end of the wiring harness. There's a clip right here that we're going to remove using one of these trim removal tools. So stick it underneath the clip and then pry upwards. Good. Now we have the speed sensor right here, which needs to get disconnected. So just press down on the tab and pull this out. And then we have a clip here that needs to be popped out. The reverse light switch here, which could just be unplugged. And the other clip, which could be popped out as well. Now we can set aside the harness, and let's remove the dust cover on the transmission so we can remove the clutch cable. This is the clutch cable, and to remove it, get a pry bar and release the pressure from the clutch fork and slide the cable up and out of the fork. Then use a flathead screwdriver to remove the retaining clip, and then the clutch cable could be removed from the transmission. And finally, the last step before we remove the transmission, we need to remove the rear transmission mount right here. There's 2 bolts, there's one there and there's one there, but before we unbolt this, we need to support the transmission so it doesn't just fall. That could put unwanted stress on the motor mounts in the front. So let's slide the transmission jack in and crank it up. Good. Now we can strap down the transmission using the strap built into the jack and make sure it's tight so this transmission won't fall off the jack. So with the transmission being strapped in and held up by the transmission jack, now we could remove the 2 bolts holding in this transmission mount, starting with the driver's side bolt. And once that's loose, just wiggle it out like so, and let's break free and remove the second and last bolt holding in this mount. Good. Alright, so with our transmission mount unbolted, wow, look at this. There is so much play in this transmission mount. We're gonna have to replace that. But anyway, with this unbolted, we've completed all of our steps so we could finally unbolt and remove the transmission. And to do that, we need to unbolt the transmission from the engine. There are
Take 1 piece sweet. Thank you. 不用点。那你回来一个。哎，你们的要4个装一起吗？要分开？皮带要分开吗？然后直接吃。一个多少？一个多少？因为那个花生粉跟这种会爆浆的，那你另外装。吃的时候比较不会吸到一些。谢谢 ，Thank you。这个是伯爵珍珠奶茶。
3个袋子，不好意思，给我一个塑胶袋。
塑胶袋，稍等一下。它塑胶袋。啊，塑胶袋。真的，那就走。
你要让他先带走的话。